You're listening ad-free on Amazon Music.
The middle-aged man felt angrier and angrier as he drove home from his latest doctor's appointment. The man had been to see the doctor 4 times about his breathing difficulties, and each time the doctor had taken chest x-rays, but he couldn't figure out what was wrong. The doctor thought that, medically speaking, the man was fine, but the man knew he was far from fine. He couldn't even climb a flight of stairs without taking countless breaks to catch his breath, and once he got into bed, he could barely muster the strength to get back out again. He was now missing work, and he was feeling so weak that it was getting hard to do much of anything. And so how could any doctor say that he was fine? After he pulled into the driveway, the man just sat there for a moment. And as he did, he realized that the feeling he was having right now was not just a feeling of frustration. He also had a much darker feeling. And that feeling was that one of these nights he was going to go to bed and not wake up again. From Ballin Studios and Wondery, I'm Mr. Ballin, and this is MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, where every week we will explore a new, baffling mystery originating from the one place we all can't escape, our own bodies. If you like today's story, please attach a very active hornet's nest to the inside of the Follow Button's toilet bowl, and then close the lid and walk away. The world can be a scary place, especially when it comes to getting sick. You could catch a virus at the gym, you could pick up a foodborne bacteria at your local restaurant, or you could even get bit by a deadly bug out for a walk on your favorite hiking trail. I mean, there are dangers everywhere, and so sometimes it just feels safer to stay at home, safe and sound on the couch. But in this episode, you'll hear 2 stories about people who found out just how dangerous staying home can actually be. Our first story is about a man in Scotland whose house becomes a living nightmare. And our second story is about a young man in Australia who found out that just sitting on your couch can actually become a health disaster. Here is our first story called A Step Too Far. On a Saturday afternoon in August of 2016, 43-year-old Philip Mackey dragged a ladder into his bathroom. Philip and his wife Marnie were working hard to fix up their home in Aberdeenshire, Scotland. And Philip, frankly, spent a lot of his weekends on these types of home improvement projects, so this was very typical. Philip carefully opened up the ladder in a corner of the bathroom and climbed up. Once he was up there, Marnie handed him a spray bottle that contained water and bleach, and then she stood back to supervise from the doorway. Philip sprayed the mixture liberally onto a cluster of mold that had grown in the corner of the room. It occurred to him that he probably should wear a face mask, but it was too late for that now. When Philip was done, he tossed the spray bottle back down to Marnie, who caught it in one hand, and then laughed at what an efficient home improvement team they had become. Philip checked his watch, and to his surprise, it was almost 5 p.m. He realized he needed to jump in the shower right away. Philip played saxophone and guitar for a local band on the weekends, and they had a show tonight. He needed to get going soon if he wanted to be on time. So he moved the ladder out of the way and turned on the shower. "15 minutes later, Philip toweled off and pulled some clothes out of his closet. He laid them out on the bed next to their cat, who was fast asleep in a tight little ball. As Philip threw his shirt on, he took a moment to look around his bedroom. The fresh coat of paint that he and Marnie had applied to the room only a week ago made the room look so polished. They'd also hung new curtains and bought a cozy feather comforter and down pillows for the bed, and so they were really starting to turn their house into a home. Philip was now running late, so he buttoned his shirt as fast as he could as he hurried down the stairs. But when he got to the landing and reached for his jacket, he had to pause to catch his breath. Philip could feel his heart pounding. It had been a while since he'd been to the gym, but he hadn't realized he was this out of shape. He felt a little embarrassed, but he didn't have time to dwell on it. Philip was in a hurry, so he grabbed his jacket and headed out the door. By the time Philip walked into the pub down the road, his pulse was back to normal and he felt okay. The band would play a great show, but by the end of the show, Philip was once again totally out of breath. and so he decided he would just need to get more exercise because he was too young to get this winded so easily. A few days later, Philip got home from work around 5 p.m. He tossed off his jacket and bounded up the stairs to his bedroom. But once again, he felt his heart start to pound about halfway up the stairs, and he had to stop to catch his breath. Marnie appeared at the top of the landing and asked if he was okay, and Philip just shook his head and said no. But then he kind of playfully told her that, hey, I'm just totally out of shape. But one morning, 2 weeks later, Philip's problems got worse. He was walking up the stairs very slowly, trying not to spill his cup of coffee, and he had only made it up to the third step when his vision became blurry and he suddenly felt very dizzy, and so Philip gripped the railing to keep from falling. Then Philip began to feel breathless, and so instinctively he just sat down and put his coffee down, and he hung his head between his knees for a few minutes until the dizziness passed. And then finally, when Philip was feeling normal again, but still just sitting there on the stairs, Philip was terrified, and so he rushed downstairs, he grabbed his phone, and he called the doctor to make an appointment. Later that week, Philip was sitting in his doctor's office. He had been coming to this general practitioner for years, and Philip trusted that he'd be able to help him. His doctor sat across from him on a stool, listening as Philip listed off his symptoms: shortness of breath, pounding heart, and dizzy spells. The doctor nodded and told Philip that he most likely had a lower respiratory infection. He said there'd been a virus going around recently, and a lot of his patients had chest congestion. He was going to run some blood tests as well, just to be sure it wasn't anything serious. But in the meantime, the doctor said he would put Philip on antibiotics for a few days, which should help Philip feel like himself again. Philip thanked the doctor and then drove straight to the pharmacy to pick up the antibiotics. And by the next afternoon, Philip was starting to feel like he had some energy again. Also, his blood tests had come back clean, and so it seemed like the antibiotics were working. But the following evening, Philip came home from work feeling absolutely exhausted. He'd barely moved all day at the office, and yet here he was, feeling like he was going to fall asleep standing up. Philip made his way to the stairs, and he leaned hard on the railing as he took the first 2 steps, but immediately he could tell his heart was racing. He went up another couple of steps, but it felt like he had just sprinted a mile, and so he stopped and bent over and began wheezing for air. Finally, he just sat down on the steps, and he leaned back on his elbows and did his best to try to take slow, even breaths. But even still, it just felt like there was this huge weight on his chest that was keeping him from breathing in fully. After a few minutes, Philip heard footsteps coming down the stairs, and he knew it was his wife Marnie coming to help him. And a moment later, he felt her hand on his back, and he let her guide him to his feet. Philip leaned heavily on Marnie's shoulder as they slowly walked up one step at a time. And then when Philip finally made it upstairs and lurched into the bedroom, he looked at the clock and he realized it had taken him 30 minutes to climb the stairs. But at this point, Philip was so exhausted that he just collapsed into the bed and asked his wife to close the curtains. He was going to attempt to sleep off whatever was going on with him. Over the next 10 days, Philip carefully took the course of antibiotics his doctor had prescribed him, but now it just didn't seem like they were doing anything. He was tired and dizzy at work. He barely had the energy to make it through his band sets every weekend. He was out of breath and exhausted basically all the time. But Philip kept hoping that he'd eventually just feel better, that he would just kind of sleep this off. One morning in October, so about 6 weeks after Philip had finished his course of antibiotics, Philip opened his eyes and immediately struggled to sit up. He rested for a moment on his back with his feet dangling off the edge of the bed, and then when he tried to sit up again, he realized that he genuinely couldn't do it. He did not have the strength just to sit up in bed. But he was feeling so defeated that he just rolled over and yelled out to his wife to please call his office and let them know he was not going to be able to come into work. Then Philip just closed his eyes and slept for the entire rest of the day. But later that night at around 2 a.m., so technically the next morning, Philip did finally wake up, but when he did, he again felt that intense pressure on his chest that made it hard to breathe. Except this time, the pressure was so intense, he literally felt like he was suffocating. And Philip's flailing woke up his wife, and as soon as she looked over and saw her husband was having this emergency, she reached for her phone to call the hospital. But right at that exact moment, Philip's lungs relaxed just enough to allow him to take in a full breath of air. And so suddenly he was calmed down for a second, and he just grabbed his wife's arm and he told her, "Don't call an ambulance." Marnie was caught off guard by his request, and so she flipped on the light and just stared at her husband, but she did put the phone down. And she would agree not to call an ambulance, but she told Philip they were done waiting whatever this was out, that he would, very soon, need to seek out medical help. Several weeks later, Philip sat in his longtime doctor's office feeling frustrated and exhausted as he waited for yet another set of x-rays of his chest. He was hoping that this time, the x-ray would actually show them why he was struggling to breathe. But this was the fourth appointment he'd made this month, and each time so far, the x-ray had come back looking totally normal. And without fail, his doctor would tell him that, hey, everything looks fine, and Philip would go home without any answers. Now, Philip trusted that his doctor knew what he was doing, but Philip was feeling extremely anxious and upset that his medical issues were still going undiagnosed. Philip was now spending most of his time in bed asleep. He had no energy, he hadn't been to work in over a month, and if he didn't get better, he would not be able to go back to work at all. And that would plunge him and Marnie into financial crisis. But that was just their financial situation. Philip also could feel his body literally breaking down. He was worried that eventually whatever was going on with him was going to kill him. Philip looked up when the door to the exam room opened, and he saw his doctor walk in, shaking his head solemnly. The doctor cleared his throat and told Philip that, once again, his x-ray looked totally normal. When Philip heard this, he just kind of snapped. Months of exhaustion and anxiety had finally bubbled up, and he just began to cry. He told his doctor that he just couldn't go on like this. The doctor sighed and nodded, agreeing that Philip was way too young to be in such dire health. The doctor was starting to suspect that Philip might need the advice of a specialist. There was a nearby clinic that specialized in urgent respiratory conditions, and the doctor promised he would call them ASAP. Philip thanked the doctor, but truthfully, he was skeptical about whether the specialist could actually help. But at the same time, he welcomed a new perspective because he was starting to give up hope. Later that day, Dr. Owen Dempsey opened up an email from Philip's general practitioner. Dr. Dempsey was a highly respected chest physician at BMI Albin Hospital, which was located only 30 minutes up the road from where Philip lived. Half an hour earlier, Philip's doctor had called Dr. Dempsey to tell him that, Philip was suffering from extreme shortness of breath and exhaustion and needed help right away. Dr. Dempsey clicked on the email attachment, which was Philip's x-ray, and it popped up on the screen. Dr. Dempsey looked it over carefully. For the most part, Philip had healthy-looking lungs. However, something strange immediately jumped out at the chest physician. He noticed that Philip's lungs appeared slightly gray, almost like someone had shaded them in with a pencil. Now, Dr. Dempsey could understand why Philip's doctor had said that everything looked normal. The grayness was actually so faint that at first, he actually thought it was a defect in the x-ray film. And so, Dr. Dempsey could clearly see why Philip's doctor had said the x-rays looked normal, because they basically did. But with Dr. Dempsey's deep knowledge of the human chest, he knew that Philip's lungs were not normal at all. The slight grayness in Philip's lungs indicated they were inflamed and that something was seriously wrong. So Dr. Dempsey decided to call Philip and see if he could figure out if anything in his environment or daily habits might be making him sick. Dr. Dempsey dialed Philip's number. After 3 rings, Philip answered, and Dr. Dempsey noticed right away that Philip was panting. Dr. Dempsey had lung cancer patients who sounded better than Philip. Philip explained that the reason he was currently so out of breath was because he walked through his house to answer the phone. That was it. Dr. Dempsey was shocked. But when he told Philip how surprised he was at Philip's shortness of breath, Philip just laughed and said he was surprised too. He said it was getting really hard to think of himself as a healthy person now that he needed half an hour just to climb his own stairs. Dr. Dempsey knew that Philip must be incredibly stressed out, and he appreciated that Philip was actually still finding ways to make light of his situation. But as desperately as Dr. Dempsey wanted to help Philip out, he really had no idea how to do it. Dr. Dempsey told Philip that he believed he could be suffering from a severe allergic reaction. Things people have in their homes, like black mold or pet dander, can trigger severe and sometimes dangerous allergic reactions. And other times, people can bring things into their home from a trip that ultimately triggers an allergy. For a moment, all Dr. Dempsey heard was just wheezing on the other end of the line. And then Philip spoke, and he told the doctor that, for the past few months, he'd barely gotten out of bed, so he certainly wasn't traveling anywhere, even within his own community. And Philip couldn't think of anything in his house that could have caused such a terrible reaction. He said there was nothing new, just the same pets they'd had for years. Now, Philip did mention that there was some mold in their bathroom, but he'd taken care of it months ago and it never came back. The doctor eventually just began to quiz Philip about potential ways he could have been exposed. And time and again, Philip shot each of them down. Even before he got sick, Philip didn't go to a health spa or other humid environments where mold could grow. He rarely went into his attic, which can also harbor mold. And since he'd gotten sick, they'd stopped remodeling the house, so he definitely was not exposing himself to any kind of home improvement chemicals. Philip said he didn't even smoke. And so by the time Dr. Dempsey had gone through his whole checklist of hazards and come up empty, he could tell Philip was close to tears. And Dr. Dempsey totally understood, because if he were in Philip's position, he would be just as scared and frustrated. Dr. Dempsey felt stumped. Nothing Philip had been exposed to recently sounded like cause for concern. So he asked Philip about the work he was doing on his house before he got sick. And Philip began describing all the painting and reupholstering they'd been doing. And in the background, Dr. Dempsey could hear Philip's wife, Marnie, reminding Philip about all sorts of other small projects they'd taken on over the past year. And at some point, Philip began rambling about his bedroom, something he was obviously very proud of. And he would tell Dr. Dempsey that they had really splurged on linen curtains and a brand new comforter. And right at that moment, as he was describing his bedroom, Dr. Dempsey had an epiphany. He suddenly understood what very likely was making Philip so sick. And so he cut Philip off and said, "How soon can you come in and get blood work done?" A few days later, Philip and Marnie sat in Dr. Dempsey's office as they went over the results of Philip's recent blood work. Dr. Dempsey smiled at them and reassured them that he did finally have a diagnosis. Dr. Dempsey explained that, generally speaking, people do not suddenly become allergic to things that they're exposed to regularly, things like pets. And even if Philip did inhale that mold in the bathroom when he was doing those home renovations, his illness should have gone away when he was no longer exposed to the mold. But when Philip told Dr. Dempsey on that phone call that he and his wife were really excited about the changes they had made to their bedroom and they had splurged on the linens and the comforter on their bed, that is what tipped Dr. Dempsey off that potentially Philip could be suffering from a very specific and very rare disease. And it would turn out Dr. Dempsey's hunch was correct. Philip's blood tests had revealed that he was having a severe allergic reaction to bird feathers. This is known as hypersensitivity pneumonitis. But not feathers from a pet bird or birds in the yard. When Philip and Marnie redid their bedroom, they'd replaced their synthetic comforter and pillows with more expensive ones that were filled with feathers. Philip was allergic to the bed that he'd been laying in for months. That's why he kept getting sicker and sicker and sicker. The doctor explained that this very strange disease is quite rare, but it is so often triggered by people's bedding that medical professionals sometimes refer to this disease as feather duvet lung disease. Duvet is another word for comforter. Although Philip had never been bothered by feathers before, Dr. Dempsey told him that symptoms of hypersensitivity pneumonitis can develop quickly and worsen as time goes by. Without treatment, hypersensitivity pneumonitis can cause permanent damage to the lungs. But thankfully, Dr. Dempsey assured him that they had caught the disease in time. Dr. Dempsey prescribed Philip steroids, and Philip got rid of the feather comforter and pillows. Within 2 days, Philip was already feeling better. And within a few weeks, he was back at work, and back to playing his saxophone in bars all across Scotland. And now for our second story, which is called Dying of Boredom. In December of 2019, 17-year-old Kyle Quitman took a deep breath of fresh air as a hospital volunteer wheeled him out the front door of a hospital in Queensland, Australia. Now, at the time, most of Kyle's friends were out celebrating the end of the school year. But Kyle had been in the hospital, having ankle reconstruction surgery to repair a really bad rugby injury. Kyle wished he could be at the beach right now with his friends, but after 3 days of being stuck inside the hospital, he was at least happy just to feel the sun on his skin. And it occurred to him that he really should try to enjoy this moment, because he was going to be mostly stuck inside for the next 3 months as his ankle healed, and while all his friends enjoyed the Australian summer that runs through February. The hospital volunteer parked Kyle's wheelchair on the curb and asked how his ankle was feeling. Kyle could feel it throb inside his cast, and he admitted that it was actually pretty tender. But a moment later, he saw his dad's car come around the corner, and suddenly he forgot all about the pain. All Kyle wanted was just to go home with his dad. Kyle's dad hopped out of the car and helped Kyle out of his wheelchair. Kyle's legs were a little shaky after 3 days on his back, but he leaned on his dad and managed to limp his way to the front passenger seat. Then off they went. The minute Kyle hobbled into his home, he could see that his mother had been carefully preparing for his arrival. She made the couch in the living room as inviting as possible, complete with fluffy pillows and his favorite blanket. There was a TV tray set up next to the couch with the TV remote, his gaming controllers, and a little bowl of candy sitting on it. Kyle smiled at all the amazing comforts his mother had assembled, but at the same time he sort of frowned because this was also where he knew he would be spending basically all of his time for the next 12 weeks, and as nice as it was, it felt pretty cramped. But in the end, Kyle just collapsed onto the couch, grabbed a controller, and started gaming. 4 days later, Kyle lay on the couch, a bowl of popcorn balancing on his stomach, as he listened to the family's pet cockatiel, Larry, repeat his name over and over again in a sing-song voice. Larry had a lot of personality, and Kyle loved to play with him. He had spent the morning trying to flick kernels across the living room and into Larry's cage. Kyle rolled a kernel in between his thumb and forefinger and then launched it across the room, and amazingly, it sailed right through the metal bars, right into the cage, and Kyle cheered as the cockatiel whistled his appreciation. But then Kyle sighed. Larry was amusing, but this had to be the most boring summer vacation of his life. A few of Kyle's friends had dropped by the night before with cookies and Gatorade, which was great, but then they all left for a party without Kyle, and he felt totally abandoned. In fact, the only person who spent any real time with him was his grandmother. She'd been coming over just about every single day to give Kyle cookies, and she would even play video games with him, but she was not good at video games. And Kyle really appreciated that, but again, he just felt totally bored and lonely. But perhaps the worst part of what Kyle was calling his, quote, couch arrest was that he still had 77 more days of being stuck in here with nothing to do except wait for his ankle to heal. So, frustrated, Kyle grabbed another kernel and launched it into Larry's cage. A moment later, Kyle heard the garage door opening, and he knew that meant his mother was back with his 14-year-old brother, Dylan, and 2 of his friends. Within seconds, 3 14-year-olds zoomed past Kyle as he sat there on the couch, and they raced out to the indoor pool that was separated from the living room by a sliding glass door. Kyle huffed and sarcastically called after them to have fun, but he didn't need to worry. All 3 teens jumped into the pool and began roughhousing, splashing water, and having a great time. Kyle's mom, Sherry, came into the living room right behind the kids, carrying a few grocery bags. As Dylan and his friends shouted and splashed around in the background, Kyle's mother told him that she was so sorry he couldn't be outside this summer. Then Kyle watched as his mother opened Larry the cockatiel's cage and set the bird on the floor for his daily walk around the living room. And as Larry began picking up popcorn kernels in his beak and marching around the room, Kyle, for the first time in his life, felt jealous of a bird. The next morning, Kyle's throat felt scratchy as he slowly came down the stairs from his bedroom. And when he coughed, he could feel phlegm coming up into his throat. As if Kyle didn't have enough problems, now he realized that he must have caught a cold from Dylan or one of his friends who came over the day before. But luckily, Kyle's mother was basically a mind reader, because moments later, she came rushing into the living room where Kyle was, and she set a few throat lozenges down next to him. She told him she'd had a cough too the week before, and she promised Kyle that his cold would likely clear up in just a day or two. 3 days later, in mid-December, Kyle was sitting on the couch as usual playing video games. He had just won a match in his favorite fighting game when he started coughing. But this time he was coughing really hard. He tried to steady his breathing, but he was hacking so much that he felt like he was fighting just to get air. Kyle wondered if maybe he was hunched over too much and kind of compressing his diaphragm. So he sat up for a minute and then just lay down on his back. But even then, he still couldn't get a full breath, and in fact, it felt like he had just run up a flight of stairs. Eventually, Kyle did get his breathing under control, but those few panicky minutes really rattled him. Later that afternoon, Kyle was laying on his back with Larry the cockatiel on his chest. Kyle was petting the bird when he felt himself struggling to breathe again. Larry fluttered to the ground as Kyle doubled over in another coughing fit. After a moment, Kyle heard footsteps coming swiftly toward the living room, and he knew his mom had heard him coughing. Moments later, Kyle's mom came flying into the room, and she put the back of her hand against Kyle's forehead, and she said he was burning up. She wondered aloud if Kyle maybe had an infection or some other complication from his surgery. Then she told Kyle that if he wasn't feeling better in the morning, they were going back to the hospital. And sure enough, by the following morning, Kyle was much worse. His stomach felt upset and his sheets were damp with sweat. His head was pounding so hard that he couldn't even open his eyes. He called out for his mom and cracked his eyelid just enough to see her come into the room. Kyle asked her for some aspirin, but Sherry thought he needed more help than that. She was going to stick to her guns and take him back to the hospital. About an hour later, Kyle laid back on the table in an examination room, his hands over his face to block the overhead light from hitting his super sensitive eyes. A doctor looked over Kyle's chart and asked if he had traveled recently or been exposed to anyone who was sick. Kyle scoffed at the idea he had been traveling anywhere and told the doctor that he hadn't left the house for 10 days. But Kyle had to admit he had been around some sick people. His brother had been out and about with friends constantly, and he had come home with a cough just last week. Kyle's mom also chimed in and said she too had a cough last week, and in fact, now that she thought about it, she'd had a cough on and off quite a bit lately. But Sherry assumed she must have gotten it from Kyle's grandmother, who'd had a cold for weeks, and she came over all the time to visit. The doctor nodded and said that it was possible that Kyle had caught the same bug that had made other family members sick. But for some reason, Kyle's symptoms seemed to be much worse than anyone else's. The doctor asked Kyle to sit up, and once he had, he pressed his stethoscope to Kyle's back. Kyle tried to breathe deeply, but he felt like there was rattling in his chest, and it was hard to fully fill his lungs with air. After listening for a minute, the doctor stepped back, frowning. He looked at Kyle, and then he looked over at Kyle's mother, and then he told them that he heard crackling in Kyle's lungs, which indicated he very likely had a fluid buildup in his chest. He told them this was extremely unusual, especially for a healthy 17-year-old with no history of respiratory issues. So whatever was making Kyle sick, it had to be serious. Kyle just stared at the doctor in disbelief, and then between his ragged breaths, he asked the doctor if he was going to be okay. The doctor told Kyle not to panic, but they would have to run a whole battery of tests to figure out what was going on with him. The doctor said it was possible that Kyle had an autoimmune disease like lupus. However, the doctor thought it was far more likely that Kyle was suffering from some kind of infection. So the doctor said he was going to send an occupational hygienist to the Quitman's home to see if there was something in their environment that was making Kyle sick. Meanwhile, Kyle would need to spend the night at the hospital for testing. As Kyle listened to the scary-sounding things the doctor was saying, he found it very difficult to stay calm. If there was something deadly hidden in the Quitman residence, he knew he'd been breathing it in for 24 hours a day, nonstop for over a week. And the rest of his family could also be in serious danger too. The next morning, Kyle woke up in his hospital bed trying not to move for fear that he would set off another coughing fit. Even though he was exhausted, he couldn't sleep the night before. Between the intense pain in his chest and the fear of what might be wrong with him, it had been very hard to relax. As he watched the TV to distract himself, his doctor gently knocked on the door frame and came inside. He told Kyle that he had some good news and bad news. The good news was, so far, all of Kyle's tests had come back negative, which ruled out an autoimmune disorder and a host of other diseases. But the bad news was, the occupational hygienist had found some possible causes for what was making Kyle sick. There were traces of mold in the Quitman's house, and the hygienist was also concerned about the family's pet cockatiel, Larry. Birds could carry all sorts of diseases, and their feathers could also set off severe respiratory issues, like what was happening to Kyle right now. When Kyle heard this, he just put his hands over his face and he groaned. He had most likely been breathing in that mold around the clock, and Larry the cockatiel had been keeping him company the entire time. Kyle asked the doctor if they'd have to get rid of their beloved bird in order to get better. The doctor shrugged and said he couldn't be sure yet. To find out what was actually infecting Kyle's lungs, they would have to insert a tube into Kyle's lungs to take a sample of the fluids. The doctor told him that that procedure is called a bronchoalveolar lavage, and when he said that, Kyle's eyes widened. Any procedure with a name that complicated had to be painful. But the doctor smiled when he saw Kyle's reaction, and he reassured him that he'd be asleep for the whole 2-hour procedure and he wouldn't feel a thing. Kyle was relieved. Now he just hoped that this test would get him the answers that he needed. Later that day, Kyle was back in his hospital room, still a bit groggy from the anesthesia from the procedure. But when the doctor came in, Kyle was aware enough to notice the very serious look on his doctor's face. The doctor said that, once again, he had good news and bad news. He said the good news was they found what was making Kyle sick, but it was not mold or Larry the cockatiel. For a moment, Kyle felt really happy that his beloved pet would not have to be exiled from the family home. But then the doctor told him the bad news. Kyle's lungs were infected with a toxic bacteria called Mycobacterium intracellular, which can be extremely dangerous. If left untreated, it could permanently damage his breathing and even cause heart failure. Before Kyle could freak out, the doctor said he was pretty sure they'd caught it early enough to avoid any serious health damage for Kyle and his family. But the Quitmans would not be safe until the source of this bacteria was located, and so the hygienist was heading back to Kyle's house right now to collect more samples. The next morning, Kyle's entire family gathered around his hospital bed while the doctor went over the hygienist's findings. The air and water samples that the hygienist had collected confirmed that the danger was coming from an unexpected place: the Quitman's indoor pool. The pool water was full of the same bacteria doctors found in Kyle's lungs, and every time people splashed around in the water, they were inadvertently spreading the bacteria up into the air. Kyle had gotten sick because he had been breathing in the unsanitary pool water. Kyle and his family would soon learn that this bacteria had been growing in their pool for months, basically right after they had switched to a different filtration system. So the entire family had been breathing in this bacteria, but Kyle got much sicker than everybody else because he was laid up on the couch right next to the pool room for 2 weeks, just sitting there breathing in that filth day in and day out. Kyle's unusual condition is known as hot tub lung, since most people get it from breathing in humid hot tub water. Kyle's family immediately had their pool deep cleaned, and they also installed a new filtration system. And pretty quickly, they all recovered and went back to their normal lives. But 2 years after the ordeal, the entire Quitman family went to a follow-up doctor's appointment and realized they had actually suffered permanent injury from their run-in with hot tub lung. Tests showed that all of their lungs now had a mild reduction in their ability to process poisonous carbon monoxide gas. It was a small but lingering reminder to make sure to always keep their pool nice and clean.
where is it? I heard the door open. I heard the bells. I heard the pot. I heard the footsteps. I saw the door open. I see the thing walk in. I watched it walk down the aisle. I watched it bend over. It's in the room. Where is it? And this is night 1. There's 2 more nights of this, and it gets worse. When I was 16 years old, I was an avid snowboarder. Starting from the time I was like 12 years old, I used to always go snowboarding with the same 2 guys, my 2 very close friends, Wolf and Nick. Every winter, me, Nick, and Wolf would go up to Nick's family's cabin that was up in the White Mountains in New Hampshire. Just snowboard, and it was great. Every time we went up to this cabin in New Hampshire, it would be me, Wolf, Nick, and then Nick's mom and dad. Unexpectedly, leading into my 16-year-old winter, Nick's father passed away. We were actually planning on going on a trip to the mountains that winter. And I remember speaking to Wolf and being like, I don't know if it's even appropriate to ask about this trip, because we knew that Nick was very close to his father, and not to mention, like, every time we went on this particular trip up to the mountains, Nick's dad was always with us, and it just seemed like, how can we possibly now go on this snowboarding trip? Not only is it a low priority item, but just the dynamic is all different now. Nick called us and was like, hey, so we are still going to do the snowboarding trip to the cabin in New Hampshire. And so Wolf and I, we spoke, and we're like, let's just go with it. I mean, maybe they want to do something that is maybe a fond memory of their father, their husband. And so we agreed to go. So he passes away maybe a few months before we end up going up to the mountains. And so the grief was still definitely there, but also just, again, that the dynamic was it was like the elephant in the room, right? Like, as we're driving up, we drove in the same car. Me, Wolf, Nick, and then Nick's mom was driving. It was so apparent that Nick's dad was missing, because he was always in the car with us when we drove up. Anyhow, so we make the trip up to New Hampshire, and we're planning to be up there for 3 days. So the house itself wasn't really a cabin, it was a house. It was a small house. It was on a mountain. And if you think about the way a mountain works, it's a slope. And so in order to have a house level on a mountain, a portion of it needs to be on stilts, right? The portion that's kind of hanging off the mountain. And then the other part of the house is kind of like embedded in the mountain itself. And when you drive up to the house, there's a wraparound porch that goes around the house. The majority of it is on the stilted section of the house, right? So if you're on the wraparound porch, your footsteps are going to echo. Like, you can hear those footsteps because you're above the ground. When you step into the house, you open a door. It actually opens inwardly. There were sleigh bells that were on the door, on the inside of the door. So anytime you open the door, you hear those sleigh bells ringing. And as soon as you step foot into the house, if you took one step into the house, right? So you step on the wraparound porch, you open the door, sleigh bells ring. When you step into the house, your right foot would be in the kitchen. You'd be standing on linoleum. And your left foot would be on shag carpet, which is like the dining room. And that's the way the house is laid out. As soon as you walk in, kitchen on your right, dining room on your left. And if you keep walking, you're going to enter into this living room. And if you turned around in the living room and looked up, you would see a lofted second floor. If you walk into the house, again, your right foot's in the kitchen, your left foot's in the dining room, and you walked as if you were going into that living space, but stopped about halfway across the house, you could look to your right and there'd be one hallway. There's only one hallway. It's a small house. And this hallway is bringing you, call it, into the mountain. If you think about, again, the layout of the house, you have a portion of the house that's sitting in the mountain and a portion of the house that's on stilts. Well, this hallway leads into the section of the house that's in the mountain. And if you go down this hallway and it turns left, it's a short little hallway, it brings you to one room. And that room is where me, Nick, and Wolf would stay every time we went snowboarding at this mountain. That room, if you go into it, it's a corner-fed room. You open the door, and immediately to your right is a bunk bed. I would always sleep on the bottom bunk, and Wolf would sleep on the top bunk. Our feet would be closest to the door. In the center of the room, with the remaining space, because this is not a big room, there was like a queen size bed. It was like a slightly larger bed that sat basically in all of the free space that was left over in the room. It was sitting right in the middle of the room, and that's where Nick would sleep. So basically the room was completely packed with 3 places to sleep and really not much else. There was a very small space between the queen size bed and the bunk bed, so you could walk between those two, but that was about it. So that layout's very important, and you'll see why. We snowboard for the day, we come back to the cabin, and me, Nick, and Wolf decide we're gonna crash super early and get up early and have a full day of riding ahead of us, because we're avid snowboarders. So we go to our room, the one that's kind of, you go down that hallway and you get to the room I just described. We planned on going to bed early, but we were excited, and so we stayed up gaming for a bit. And then maybe around like 11 or 12 o'clock at night, Nick, who again is in the queen size bed, and Wolf was in the top bunk, they ultimately fall asleep. I was still awake, and what struck me, and it always struck me whenever I slept in this room, is when you turn off all the electronics and you're just laying in bed in this house, in particular this room, it is pitch black. There's no windows. You're in the segment of the house that's, in the mountain. It is truly pitch black. Not to mention the house itself, there weren't really any neighbors nearby, because this house, Nick's family had purchased it a while ago when this used to be an active ski resort, the mountain itself that it was on. But it wasn't anymore, and most people that were living there had left and sold their property. But a few people had decided to stay, and so Nick's family was one of them. So they had this cabin on an abandoned ski resort. There was virtually no streetlights, there's virtually no neighbors, and so at night, when you're laying in this room, like I was this night, you're really struck by just how dark and quiet it is. I mean, basically no white noise, silence and pitch black. And so I'm laying there, and one other detail that needs to be brought up before we get into what actually happens. So Nick had 2 much older brothers. They were in their 30s, and we're 16 years old. And we were expecting one of them, we didn't know which, to swing by the house at some point over the next few days. That's what Nick's mom had said. Nick had kind of reiterated it. And I think that Wolf and I understood that, now that Nick's father was gone, that they were just kind of trying to find a way to fill the void that was left from the father passing. And so we were expecting over the course of that weekend for someone, one of the 2 brothers, to come to this house and stay with us for a night or whatever it was. I had never met either of these 2 brothers. I knew they existed, but I had never met them before. But somewhere in the back of my mind, I know that probably one of them is going to show up at some point, maybe tonight, maybe tomorrow, whenever it is. Man, it's giving me goosebumps just thinking about this. So that night, as I'm laying in bed, I'm thinking about how dark and quiet it is. I remember the only light in the room was the digital clock, the little red digital clock, and it was like a beacon in the light, and that doesn't emit much light, but when it's pure darkness, it does. And I just could not fall asleep. I remember I got to a place where I started counting how many hours of sleep I might get if I fell asleep right then and there, which is never a good sign. That means you're not close to sleeping. If you're like, okay, if I fell asleep now, I'll get 3 hours and 22 minutes of sleep, right? Like that's where I was at mentally. At some point, I think it was around 3 a.m, I remember looking at the clock and thinking, wow, it's gotten so late and I'm still awake. I hear footsteps on the wraparound porch. In a situation where, as I'm telling it, you're gonna think, how did you not raise, a red flag immediately? In real time, in real life, your brain goes to great measures to convince you that everything is okay. It really takes an enormous amount of anomalies to stack up for your brain to say something's wrong. And so that's what happened in this first night. I hear footsteps on the wraparound porch, and I immediately assume, even though we're talking, it's like 3 a.m, I just assume that it's got to be one of Nick's brothers arriving to be a part of this weekend getaway. So I really actually didn't think anything of it. I actually just thought, well, when he comes in the house, if he happens to come in here to check on us, I'll just pretend to be asleep in case, he were to see that I was awake. I don't want to have a conversation with him. Number 1, it's 3 a.m. Number 2, I don't know the guy. I'm just going to pretend to be asleep. So that's all I'm thinking about. Not worried, not scared, not anything. Footsteps on the wraparound porch. And then the door opens, and I can hear the sleigh bells that are on the door itself. I can hear those chime as the door opens. Again, no part of me is concerned about this. I'm thinking it's a little bit weird that they're arriving at 3 a.m, but we knew that his brothers had these weird work schedules where they might show up in the middle of the night. So it was just, it was whatever it was. Sleigh bells ring, and then I hear what sounds like a pot, like a kitchen pot, fall and hit the linoleum floor in the kitchen. And I remember just the sound stood out to me. It just seemed like this person's kind of making a bit of a commotion in the middle of the night here. And the door didn't shut. And I noticed that. I figured they were maybe bringing their stuff in, right? They're offloading some stuff. And they're leaving the door open. Oh, just thinking about this, it's really making me feel uncomfortable. So I hear the footsteps in the wraparound porch, the door opens, I can hear the sleigh bells, a pot falls and it hits the linoleum floor. The footsteps that I could hear on the wraparound porch, because it's on stilts, right? Like the porch is hovering over the ground. You can hear those footsteps. Well, when these footsteps continued into the house, where you're on a concrete slab and there should be no sound, like I shouldn't hear echoing footsteps, it sounded like it was on the wraparound porch still, but the noise was getting closer to me. So it was like the footsteps sounded totally natural out on the wraparound porch, but once they were in the house, it didn't really make any sense that I could hear them as if the footsteps were standing on something that was suspended off the ground. But it wasn't. You're in the house on a concrete slab. And so I hear these footsteps. The door hasn't shut. The front door is wide open. We're in the middle of winter here. We're in the middle of nowhere too. And I'm thinking about that, but I'm still thinking it's got to be Nick's brother, one of Nick's brothers. The footsteps continue through the house. And they stop about halfway through the house. If you open that door and walk halfway through the house. And then the footsteps began to walk down the hallway towards our room. So they come down the hall. And they get right outside the door, which is shut. The door to our room is shut. And I'm sitting there. Again, my feet are closest to the door. It's pitch black in the room, minus the, digital clock. And I'm thinking, why didn't they shut the front door? Of all the weird things that have happened, the fact that I'm hearing footsteps as if they're on the wraparound porch, but they're getting louder and moving through the house, the thing that really just made the hair on the back of my neck stand up was, why didn't they shut the front door? That just seems like such a bad idea. There's animals out there. There's a host of things out there. Like, why aren't you shut? And not to mention, it's freezing outside. There's a space between the bunk bed, the bottom bunk that I'm on, and the top bunk. There's a space that I can see clear as day. Whoever walks in the room, I'm gonna see them when they walk past the foot of the bed. But because of the top bunk, my view is actually obscured, and I wouldn't be able to make out someone's face, for example. I could really only see their middle section. And so when the door opens and this shadow figure walks into the room, which, by the way, I'm in a pitch black room, and I clearly make out a black silhouette. This thing walks into the room, and it's obscured, so I wouldn't have been able to see its head or upper body anyways, but its hips are so high that I can't even really see those. Those are at the level that I would expect someone's upper body or head to be at, meaning this figure that's walked in, its legs are extremely long, and so if it was proportionally the size of a human, you're talking about maybe a 10-foot tall person, but we're in a space that is not a 10-foot high ceiling. And so this thing walks in, and as soon as I see it, and I make out that black silhouette, even though it's pitch black in the room, I clearly see this silhouette that is unnaturally tall, combined with all the things that I've just thought about, mainly the door's still open. They've made kind of a commotion. I can hear these weird footsteps. I instantly was frozen with terror. Frozen. Petrified. I'm like, it's not Nick's brother. And even if we're not talking about paranormal here, this is such a bad situation. Even if that's just some dude who's come into the house, that's a really bad situation. So no matter what, this is a really bad situation, but what I'm looking at doesn't make sense. It's an unnaturally tall person. They've left the door open, and I hear their footsteps all over the house, and it walks in past the foot of the bed. And I'm laying there, and I can't see higher than its waist because it's obscured by the top bunk. And this thing makes this like facing movement, like a military facing movement, and begins to walk down the aisle between the queen size bed in the middle of the room and the bunk bed where I am. And it's walking down right next to me, and I'm literally sitting there unable to move. And I remember thinking, I can't do anything. I'm truly frozen with terror. And all I remember thinking is, whatever happens, just don't bend down and look at me. That will ruin my life. If this thing so much as looks at me, that's it, I'm done. So it walks down the aisle, it's right next to me. I'm literally frozen. And it does another quick movement, but it's facing away from me now. Facing towards Nick in the center of the room. And it bows onto and then down through Nick's bed and disappears. In a movie, as soon as the ghost disappears into the floor, whoever's hiding would make a run for it. In real life, there's no such thing as ghosts. There's no such thing as people disappearing into the ground. So I'm expecting this thing to just get back up again. I couldn't understand that it was, what did it disappear into the bed? That's not possible. Where is it? I heard the door open. I heard the bells. I heard the pot. I heard the footsteps. I saw the door open. I see the thing walk in. I watched it walk down the aisle. I watched it bend over. It's in the room. Where is it? And for hours, all night, I laid there absolutely petrified, expecting this thing to come back up and just look at me. That was like my biggest fear, is whatever this thing was, I did not want it to look at me. So that was the worst. I'm laying there frozen. I can only move my eyes all night. Finally, I hear Nick's mom out in the living room making coffee. This was probably like 5, 6 in the morning. And it was like the first time that I'm like, okay, I'm safe now. Even if it's in the room, I'm safe to just go because I can hear someone out there. And I could hear her speaking. I knew it was her. And so I go right out there. And now you got to understand that even though this was a horrible situation that I still can't really explain, I know that she has just lost her husband. And so the idea of approaching this subject, which effectively is going to turn into ghosts, right? I've never had a paranormal experience before this. I've never had a paranormal experience since, right? Like I'm more or less a skeptic, and I'm going to go out there and I'm going to start talking about ghosts to the woman who's recently bereaved. It just felt really inappropriate. And so I was really struggling with how I wanted to communicate what happened. And so I went to the table, she got me a cup of coffee, and and we know each other well, she knows me well. And she definitely picked up that something was wrong, but didn't really ask anything yet. She was just kind of puzzling, like kind of sizing me up a little bit. And the only thing I could think to do was to just ask, hey, did either of your two sons, Nick's older two brothers, did they stop by at any point last night? Did they stop by? And she's like, no. And I'm sitting there like, okay. And I'm just like, I must have had a reaction that was obvious to her. And she just goes, I heard my husband here last night too. And, that made it a lot worse. Because on the one hand, you have a situation where she is confirming something that part of me hopes is a bad dream. Number two, she's now saying it's her husband. And so I intuitively assumed that she has somehow figured out what I'm stressed about that probably isn't real. And because she's grieving, she's created a story where her husband is now in the house, looking over us. I really believed that she didn't hear anything. That she just somehow understood that I had this weird feeling and she'd turned it into my husband's in the house. And I just couldn't ask any more questions at that point. I felt like I had set her up for this awkward exchange. I felt really bad that like that was the discussion we were having. I also thought like, if that's true, I don't want to have this conversation. Like I really was just dumbfounded on what to do in this situation. And this is night one. There's 2 more nights of this, and it gets worse. So Nick and Wolf eventually come out of the bedroom and they come to the dining room. And the same way I felt reserved talking to Nick's mom about what happened, I had the same feelings about Nick because it was his father. And I also just felt like that would be inappropriate. But Wolf, he's not a family member and he's my buddy. And I kind of pulled him aside and I kind of told him what was going on as best as I could. But I kept it like kind of generic. I was like, you know, I could have sworn I heard someone in the house last night. Like I could have sworn. And he's like, yeah, you know, you're probably dreaming. You know, like that's what this is. And I was like, no, like I wasn't, but I can't make sense of it. And I was like, can you just do me a favor? And at this point, Nick actually overheard the conversation, and I very much kind of cut ties with what I was talking about. I was like, yeah, I just thought I heard something last night. It's just me freaking myself out. And I was like, can you guys tonight, when we get back from snowboarding, can I fall asleep ahead of you? That way I'm asleep, you guys can just fall asleep after I do, and then I'll sleep through the night, no big deal. And they're like, all right, yeah, weirdo, whatever. So I'm like, all right, my big plan is I'm just gonna go to bed really, really early. Because I didn't sleep the night before, so I'm thinking, oh, I'll fall asleep right away. So we go out, we snowboard for the day, my mind is off of what happened, and frankly, I'm starting to convince myself that had to have been, you know, sleep paralysis. Even though I'd never had that before, I was Googling some stuff, maybe it was sleep paralysis, maybe it was just like a really intense dream. You know, I would just like, there has to be something. Like this is too weird, it has to be something explainable. Turns out it wasn't. We get back from snowboarding, and I am immediately going to bed. Pretty much immediately. It was like maybe 6 o'clock. I was like, I'm going to bed. And I get in bed, and all I'm thinking about is what happened the night before, and I can't fall asleep. Eventually, Nick and Wolf, they come in the room, and they're trying their best to stay awake so that I can fall asleep, but it's getting later and later, and I can't fall asleep. And now I'm back to that, like, okay, if I fall asleep now, I get 6 hours of sleep. And they finally just said, hey man, I'm tired, I'm going to bed. So they both fall asleep, and I'm awake. And I was so upset with myself. Like, you screwed yourself. Why didn't you just fall asleep, you dummy? And I remember the only thing that I did that really made this real, looking back at it, is I put a knife, like a kitchen knife or something, in the springs above me. So I'm in the bottom bunk, like basically right under the top bunk, I put a knife in there. And I'm laying in bed, and I'm constantly looking over at the digital clock. And it was probably around 3 a.m. It was late enough that it was like, okay, this is about the time that happened last night. And my heart just sunk when I heard those footsteps on the wraparound porch again. They sounded the same as they did the night before. I was like, that has to be one of Nick's brothers. But the door opens, I hear the sleigh bells, I hear the frickin' pot fall on the ground. It was like deja vu. The exact same thing is happening. And these footsteps start walking through the house. And again, referencing how movies would portray this, you know, the person who's me in the movie is like, okay, I'm gonna get this knife and I'm gonna position myself over here because I know what's gonna happen and I'm gonna protect myself. In real life, I'm like, this thing's gonna be in my room, potentially. It happened last night. It's apparently happening again. Please, for the love of God, don't bow into me the way it bowed into the floor the night before. Don't look at me. It will ruin my life if some entity just engages with me, just looks at me. That will ruin my life. This thing walks down the hall, and I hear those footsteps coming down the hall. And just pretend for a second, forget the paranormal aspect. Pretend it's the middle of the night in the middle of nowhere, and a stranger is walking around your house. That alone is horrifying. The footsteps come right outside the door, and I'm looking at the knife that's right underneath the bed. And I'm petrified. I cannot move. I'm drenched in sweat. Just from the few seconds that it's taken this thing to go from the door to the front of my bedroom. Because I know what's happening again. It's happening again. I'm not crazy. It's just happening again. What the F is this? And I'm petrified. I can't reach. I'm so worried about making any noise that would alert this thing that I'm here. That I can only move my eyes. And I remember even thinking that I shouldn't move my eyes too quickly because it might hear that. Like, this is a primal level of fear. The door opens. It walks into the room, goes right past the foot of my bed, and I'm, again, petrified. And it walks down, after making its facing movement, it walks down the aisle between me and Nick. And I remember what happened the night before, where it folded into Nick and disappeared, and I'm just thinking to myself, please don't turn and bow into me. Please, whatever happens, just don't do that. So it turns away from me and does the same thing it did the night before, folds onto Nick and disappears into the ground. But again, even though in the movies, this would be the same thing happening, night 2, it's the same routine. It'd be like, oh, the ghost is in the floor now. I can go alert the authorities because now it's safe. In real life, I'm like, where did it go? I know this happened last night, but it still doesn't make any sense. It's in the room. It has to be. This is a real thing. It came in the room. It's somewhere. Is it under my bed? Where is it? All night, I lay there. This is the second night that I've not slept. When I heard Nick's mom out in the other room, it was like such a relief. Because I didn't give a crap at this point about being polite. I wasn't gonna try to, distance myself from the conversation around ghosts. I was gonna go out there and be like, what's wrong with this house? And so I hear her and I go right out to the living room and I tell her everything in as acute detail as I possibly can. And as I'm telling her this, her reaction didn't line up. Her reaction was not surprise, terror, confusion. It was empathy. She felt bad for me. It was sympathy. You don't understand. I'm listening, but you just don't understand what's happening. And I'm telling her every detail I can possibly muster. And at the end of it, or towards the end, she just kind of stops me. She's like, John, I told you yesterday, and again, I heard it last night. That's just my husband. I heard him last night too. You got nothing to worry about. And I was like, no. That cannot be. Cannot be what it is. And she was like, I heard him open the door. I heard the pot fall. I heard him walk through the house. I'm assuming he went into Nick's room again with you guys. And I'm like, what is happening? So totally now just beside myself. I remember I was crying actually. During this conversation, I'm just crying. Not even tears of sadness as much as just what's happening. I needed my mom. I felt so helpless. And no offense to Nick's mom, but I just felt like I was with a lunatic. How? But at the same time, she's recalling the exact same things as me. How do I put that together? I remember thinking I need to leave. I need to get out of here. I can't be here anymore. But then I thought about, like, how am I going to make this happen? Nick's mom and Wolf and Nick, they aren't leaving today. And it was pretty clear that Nick's mom liked the fact that she, heard her husband walking around the cabin. She's not trying to leave. There's one more night that we're here, and I would have to tell my parents to drive, my mom or my dad, to drive to New Hampshire and come get me because I'm seeing ghosts. Like, this was a trip that I loved. I looked forward to this trip every year. It wouldn't have made any sense, and they would have been like, what's wrong with you? And I honestly was not prepared to have those conversations with my mom and dad. I was not prepared to be like, let me tell you about the ghost I saw over the past 2 days. And so I was just kind of resigned and decided to stay. In retrospect, I think I should have called my parents and been like, that's what parents are for. Like, get the hell up here. It doesn't matter why. Come get me. But it was such a confusing moment that I had no blueprint for how to handle. So I just stayed. Nick and Wolf finally get up. And I remember I made that decision as I'm sitting there thinking about what's happening, is Nick's mom is reassuring me, about her husband being in the house. And I make the decision that I'm going to stay. Nick and Wolf come out of the room, and they come over, and Wolf pretty much immediately looks at me to get a gauge on what happened. And you can see it all over my face. I've been crying. And I told them what happened. And, Nick was always kind of a stoic, and he was just unaffected, Wolf, on the other hand, was more inclined to, at a minimum, believe something was happening. He didn't know if it was a ghost or not, but he certainly understood that something's going on. And the fact that Nick's mom, as I'm explaining to Nick and Wolf what's going on, she was like reinforcing my argument. Yeah, I heard him too. I heard the door open. Yeah, I was upstairs. I heard him walk through the house. And Wolf's like, what's going on? And Nick is like, he didn't want to hear it, kind of. It probably was uncomfortable. It's about his father, or ultimately talking about his father. Before we went out snowboarding for the day, because Nick's mom would drive us and drop us off, she brought us to a local store, and we bought a coffee table because they've been looking to replace the one that was in their house. Basically, when you walk into the house, instead of turning down the hallway towards our room, if you just keep walking into the lofted area, at the foot of the stairs was a coffee table where they kept a landline phone, because you're in the middle of nowhere and you got to have some way to call, and they put it right at the foot of the stairs in this little coffee table. But it had broken, or it was old, or whatever. I know they wanted a new one for a long time. We went out and got it. Me, Nick, and Wolf, we snowboard. We come back. We help offload the coffee table into the house. We put it at the foot of the stairs. And that night, we go to bed. I was ruthless in trying to keep Wolf and Nick awake. I mean, I wasn't even trying to make jokes out of it. I was like straight up kicking the bunk, like kicking Wolf's bunk, like literally shaking Nick. I was doing everything in my power to keep them awake because I couldn't sleep. I'm terrified. It was like the opposite of how excited you get before Christmas and you can't sleep. It was like the opposite of those feelings, but you still can't sleep. It was like, this is the worst night of my life. And also, the nail in the coffin, if you will, is during the day that day, we found out that neither of Nick's two brothers were going to be making the trip. They weren't going to make it. So no one's going to be at the house. No one should be at the house except for us. And so that night I'm laying there, and after all my attempts to keep Nick and Wolf awake, they fall asleep. Everyone's asleep. The house is pitch black. It's silent. And around 2, 3 in the morning, I'm getting goosebumps just thinking about it. I hear those footsteps on the wraparound porch. The door opens and I hear the sleigh bells ringing on the door. A pot falls on the ground and the footsteps walk into the house. And this is the third time that this has happened. So in a way, this was the first time that I was expecting something to happen. For it to walk down the hall, to come in the room, to come next to me, fold into Nick, and then that's it. This was the first time I had a little bit of, call it security, that something was going to happen, and I understood what was going to happen. I didn't understand it, but I expected something to happen. But this was not the case this night. It walked into the house. Everything was the same. It walked into the house, but instead of going down the hallway towards our room, it kept walking into the lofted area. And the lofted area, from where I was laying, my foot's at the door, my head's back here, the wall straight, if I like sat up in bed and looked straight, the wall right there led into the area where this thing was. So I'm basically, if there wasn't a wall, I'd be looking dead at this thing. And I'm waiting for it to walk through the wall. As crazy as that sounds, I'm just anticipating something coming through the wall. After a long pause of it being in that lofted area, I hear it go up the steps. Listening to the creak of the steps as it goes up the steps, it makes my skin crawl. It's making me like emotional thinking about how terrifying that was. It walks up the stairs, and now it's above me. And if the past 2 nights are any example, this thing has sunk into the ground 2 nights in a row and disappeared. And so now my fear is it's going to literally come through the ceiling, through the bunk, onto me. The sound stopped when it was upstairs. Got upstairs, and that's where Nick's mom slept. She was upstairs. So I laid in bed, petrified once again. I got my stupid knife sitting in the underside of the bed above me. And hours and hours of waiting for my literal worst nightmare to come true as some entity comes through the ceiling and goes into me. Or even just if it was like onto Nick, if it came through the ceiling and if out of my peripheries I'm watching like this beast come through the ceiling and float down and into Nick. It just, these thoughts in my head, they didn't make any sense. They were terrifying, but they were happening. I laid in bed and I couldn't fall asleep. I was now coming up on 3 days without sleep. So at some point that night, I did fall asleep, probably just out of sheer exhaustion. At some point in the morning, early morning, now probably like 5 in the morning, I wake up again and I can hear Nick's mom. It didn't sound like she was making coffee. It sounded like something was wrong. I couldn't place it, but it just sounded like she was acting emotional somehow. I couldn't tell if she was crying or not. But now it's like it's the morning, it's my last day, I'm leaving today, I'm up, I'm out. And as soon as I walk out of the hallway and I look to the left into the dining room where I expect to see Nick's mom, and she's not there. And she's actually over at the foot of the stairs in the lofted kind of living room area next to this new coffee table we had just put in. And she's standing over this coffee table at the foot of the stairs where the entity had been the night before, the one deviation from the other 2 nights. And she's crying. Come here. She points to the coffee table. And she's down on her knees looking at the table. And now I can tell she's probably crying tears of joy. Because scratched into the coffee table were the words, "I love you." I was like, I'm done. That ended my friendships with certainly Nick. Wolf to a lesser degree, but I stopped snowboarding. I didn't go back to that cabin, even though I know Wolf did the next year. The theories about what happened, Nick's mom, it's possible she could have created a narrative, made it about her husband, and then she could have just as easily scratched that into the table. The "I love you," that could have been her. It's also possible that